The morning of November 14th, 1942, somewhere between Casablanca and the Atlas Mountains, Private First Class Raymond Kellner crouches behind a Browning M250 caliber machine gun mounted on a hastily dug gun pit. The weapon sits on an M3 tripod with the M1 elevator adapter, a 40-pound extension that's supposed to give him the angle he needs to engage aircraft. His hands are shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the adrenaline that comes with knowing you're about to fire at something that wants to kill you. Above him, the sky is that particular shade of North African blue that seems impossibly clean until you realize there's a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka diving toward your position at 300 miles per hour with a 550-pound bomb slung beneath its belly. Kellner does exactly what 3 months of training at Camp Davis, North Carolina has taught him to do. He centers the ring sight on the aircraft's fuselage, tracks it smoothly as it grows larger in his vision, and squeezes the butterfly trigger. The Browning roars, 450 rounds per minute, hammering out in controlled bursts. Hot brass casings spray across the sand. Tracer rounds arc upward, bright orange lines connecting his position to the diving aircraft. Every single round passes behind the Stuka's tail. The German pilot doesn't even adjust his dive angle. The bomb releases at 1,500 feet. Kellner abandons his gun and throws himself flat as the explosion turns the supply depot, 200 yards behind him, into a column of black smoke and scattered debris. By the time he looks up, the Stuka is already climbing away, its distinctive inverted gull wings catching the sunlight as it escapes back toward Axis-held territory. Kellner has just fired 112 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition at a target he couldn't miss seeing. He has achieved 0 hits, and he is not alone. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In the first 3 weeks of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa that began on November 8, 1942, American anti-aircraft gunners fired an estimated 230,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition at attacking German and Italian aircraft. The number of confirmed kills attributed to these machine guns was 37. That works out to 1 aircraft destroyed for every 6,200 rounds expended. The mathematics were damning in ways that went beyond simple ammunition waste. The M2 Browning was perfectly capable of destroying aircraft. The 50 BMG armor-piercing incendiary round could penetrate nearly an inch of face-hardened steel at 200 yards and could tear through aluminum aircraft skin like tissue paper. A sustained 2-second burst, 15 rounds, hitting the engine or cockpit of a Stuka or Messerschmitt would be sufficient to bring it down. The weapon wasn't the problem. The gunners couldn't hit what they were shooting at. This wasn't incompetence. These were trained soldiers who had passed qualification courses at dedicated anti-aircraft artillery schools scattered across the American South. They had learned to identify aircraft silhouettes at a glance, memorized the specifications of every Axis bomber and fighter, practiced loading drills until they could swap ammunition cans in under 10 seconds while wearing thick winter gloves. They understood their weapon intimately, could field strip an M2 blindfolded, knew the maximum effective range was 2,000 yards against ground targets and 1,500 against aircraft. But not one training manual, not one instructor, not one official army publication had successfully taught them the single most important skill required to hit a moving aircraft. They didn't understand deflection. The problem was deceptively simple. An aircraft, traveling at 300 miles per hour, covers 440 feet every second. A 50 caliber bullet leaving the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second seems instantaneous, but at typical engagement ranges of 400 to 800 yards, that bullet required between 0.4 and 0.8 seconds to reach the target's position. During that fraction of a second, the aircraft moved forward between 175 and 350 feet. A gunner aiming directly at what he could see was actually shooting at where the aircraft had been a half-second ago. By the time the bullets arrived at that point in space, the aircraft was already gone. The solution required leading the target, aiming at empty sky ahead of the aircraft's flight path, firing at a point the aircraft hadn't reached yet. It was counterintuitive. It violated every hunting instinct humans had developed over millennia, and the army had comprehensively failed to train for it. The flexible gunnery schools that rushed thousands of anti-aircraft gunners through accelerated training between January and November 1942 focused overwhelmingly on mechanical proficiency. Students learned to operate their weapons flawlessly. They fired at towed sleeve targets, moving at perhaps 150 miles per hour in straight, predictable paths at known altitudes. These exercises taught trigger discipline and ammunition conservation. They did not teach deflection shooting against combat-speed aircraft executing evasive maneuvers. Technical Manual 9-15-21-310, the official Army Guide for Operation and Maintenance of the M2 Browning in the anti-aircraft role, devoted exactly 2 paragraphs on page 83 to the concept of leading moving targets. The instruction read, "When engaging crossing targets, gunners must compensate for aircraft speed and range by aiming ahead of the visible target position. The amount of lead required increases with target speed and engagement range." That was it. No diagrams, no specific angles, no practical exercises. The manual assumed soldiers would simply understand how to translate that abstract principle into real-world action while under fire from aircraft trying to kill them. They didn't. Staff Sergeant Marcus Delahunt, assigned to the 405th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, kept a journal throughout his service in North Africa. His entry for November 21, 1942, captured the frustration with brutal clarity. "Watched 3 Me-109s strafe our motor pool this morning. Every gun opened up. Must have put 5,000 rounds in the air. Saw one German fighter take a single hit in the wing. He waggled at us and flew away. We're shooting at ghosts. The bastards are where we're aiming by the time we pull the trigger, but our bullets are hitting empty air. Don't know how to fix this. Nobody does." The Luftwaffe and Italian Regia Aeronautica understood this vulnerability. German pilots reported with surprise that American anti-aircraft fire in the early weeks of the North African campaign was less effective than they had expected. Italian Stuka pilots, who had faced British Bofors 40mm guns and experienced RAF fighters throughout the Mediterranean theatre, found American 50 caliber fire easier to ignore than the weapons they'd encountered previously. It wasn't that the Americans lacked courage or determination. It was that their bullets weren't arriving where the aircraft actually were. The cost mounted quickly. Without effective anti-aircraft suppression, Axis aircraft operated with relative impunity over American positions. Supply depots burned, ammunition dumps exploded, field hospitals took hits, men died in their foxholes when they should have been protected by the curtain of 50 caliber fire that was supposed to keep enemy aircraft at bay. By early December 1942, the situation had deteriorated to the point where Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding 2 Corps, personally requested anti-aircraft gunnery specialists from the States to address what he termed systemic failures in air defense effectiveness. His memo, dated December 7th, noted that current anti-aircraft gunners were well trained in weapon operation but fundamentally unable to engage maneuvering targets with acceptable hit rates. The Army's response was to send Captain Theodore Whitmore, a 34-year-old former schoolteacher from Wisconsin who had been teaching advanced gunnery at the Anti-Aircraft Artillery School in Fort Bliss, Texas. Whitmore arrived in Oran, Algeria, on December 28, 1942, with orders to assess the problem and recommend solutions. He spent his first 2 weeks in theatre simply watching gunners engage enemy aircraft during raids. What he observed matched the reports. Gunners were aiming directly at aircraft and missing consistently. The few hits achieved came almost entirely during head-on engagements where the aircraft was flying straight toward the gun position, minimizing deflection error, or during the brief moment when aircraft pulled out of dives and flew nearly parallel to the ground, again reducing the angular velocity the gunner needed to compensate for. Crossing shots, where aircraft passed perpendicular to the gun position, achieved hit rates near zero. This was exactly the attack profile German and Italian pilots preferred because it minimized their exposure time while maximizing their bombing accuracy. A Stuka diving at 70 degrees could release its bomb, pull up, and be out of effective range in under 15 seconds. Gunners firing at the dive saw the aircraft in their sights for perhaps 6 of those seconds, and if they were aiming directly at what they could see, they weren't hitting anything. Whitmore's background as a teacher gave him perspective that pure military men often lacked. He understood that knowledge without practical application was useless, and that human beings learn complex motor skills through repetition, not through reading manuals. The deflection problem wasn't a knowledge gap. Every gunner knew intellectually that they needed to lead targets. The problem was that knowing something and executing it under stress were completely different challenges. He began interviewing the handful of gunners who had achieved confirmed kills. These men were statistical outliers, soldiers who through natural aptitude or prior experience had figured out deflection shooting on their own. Corporal James Denton from the 451st AAA Battalion had grown up hunting ducks in Louisiana marshlands. He instinctively understood leading moving targets because he'd spent his teenage years shooting at waterfowl in flight. His natural skill translated directly to anti-aircraft work. In 7 engagements, he'd achieved 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables. Technical Sergeant Paul Vincenzo from the 763rd AAA Battalion had been a trap shooter before the war, competing in regional competitions across Pennsylvania. Trap shooting requires hitting clay discs, traveling at 40 miles per hour while they're still rising and accelerating. The principles of leading a moving target were burned into his muscle memory. He'd tallied 4 confirmed kills in his first month of combat, but Denton and Vincenzo were exceptions. Most American gunners came from backgrounds that provided no relevant experience. They were farm boys who'd hunted deer from stationary positions, city kids who'd never fired a weapon before enlistment, factory workers whose only shooting experience came from brief basic training rifle qualification. They had no framework for understanding how to aim at something that wasn't where they were shooting. Whitmore spent January 1943 developing a training program based on what the successful gunners were doing instinctively. He couldn't change human instinct, but he could provide practical methods that converted abstract understanding into executable technique. His approach focused on 3 core principles: reference points, sustained tracking, and immediate feedback. The reference point system addressed the fundamental problem of how much to lead. Rather than trying to calculate angles or distances, Whitmore taught gunners to use the aircraft itself as a measuring stick. For a fighter crossing at moderate speed, aim 1 aircraft length ahead of the nose. For a bomber crossing at high speed, aim 2 lengths ahead. For a diving aircraft that would pull up and cross, start 3 lengths ahead and track through the pullout. These weren't perfect calculations. They were approximations that gave gunners a concrete visual reference instead of asking them to aim at empty sky with no guide. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 had a fuselage length of approximately 29 feet. At 400 yards range, 1 aircraft length translated to roughly 40 feet of lead, close enough to put bullets in the vicinity of the target where the M2's dispersion pattern increased hit probability. The sustained tracking drill addressed the tendency of gunners to freeze their aim once they'd established what they thought was the correct lead. Whitmore emphasized continuous motion, keeping the gun moving at the same angular rate as the target throughout the engagement. The sight picture should show the aiming point maintaining position relative to the aircraft, not locked on a fixed point in space. This was similar to how shotgun shooters track flying birds, maintaining smooth swing through the shot. The immediate feedback component required something the flexible gunnery schools back in the States lacked: live aerial targets performing combat realistic maneuvers. Whitmore couldn't requisition enemy aircraft for practice, but he could use Allied aircraft flying realistic attack profiles at combat speeds. Working with the 12th Air Force, he arranged for P-40 Warhawks to conduct simulated strafing runs over designated training areas, while gunners fired tracer-only ammunition. Tracer rounds were the key. Unlike training back home where students might not see where their shots went, tracers created visible feedback. Gunners could watch their rounds arc through the sky and see immediately whether they were leading correctly, undershooting, or overshooting. This allowed real-time correction. A gunner who saw his tracers passing behind the aircraft's tail knew to increase his lead. One who saw tracers flash ahead of the nose knew to reduce lead and track more precisely. The training was dangerous. P-40 seconds flying simulated attack runs at 300 miles per hour at altitudes under 500 feet were genuinely at risk if a gunner made a serious error. Whitmore mitigated this by starting with high-altitude passes at slower speeds, gradually increasing difficulty as gunners improved. The pilots volunteered for the duty, understanding that better-trained anti-aircraft gunners meant more effective protection for everyone when the Luftwaffe showed up. The first experimental training session ran on January 26, 1943, outside Tebura, Tunisia. Whitmore selected 40 gunners from various battalions, men who represented the typical cross-section of American anti-aircraft artillery. For 4 hours, they fired at P-40 seconds, making repeated passes while Whitmore and his assistant instructors provided immediate coaching. The improvement was immediate and dramatic. Gunners who had never successfully led a target began putting tracer streams in front of attacking aircraft. The muscle memory of sustained tracking started developing. By the end of the first session, several gunners were consistently keeping their fire within one aircraft length of the P-40 seconds throughout the entire pass. They still weren't hitting, since tracer-only rounds at training speeds weren't the same as live combat, but the fundamental skill was forming. Word spread quickly through 2 Corps. Battalion commanders whose gunners were struggling requested access to Whitmore's training program. By mid-February, he'd expanded to running daily sessions with rotating groups of 50 to 75 gunners at a time. The 12th Air Force provided more aircraft, including a 20 Havoc light bombers, to simulate the size and speed profile of Stukas. The real test came during the Kasserine Pass offensive in late February 1943. German forces under Erwin Rommel launched a major attack through the Kasserine Pass, attempting to roll up American positions and threaten the entire Allied position in Tunisia. Luftwaffe support was intensive, with Stukas and Bf-109s flying constant ground attack missions against American units. Several battalions that had gone through Whitmore's deflection training were positioned along the American defensive line. Their performance diverged sharply from units that hadn't received the new training. The 451st AAA Battalion, which had completed the full 4-session training cycle, claimed 14 confirmed aircraft kills and 21 probables during the 5-day battle. Their ammunition expenditure averaged 1,800 rounds per confirmed kill, a 67% improvement over the previous 6,000-round average. The 763rd AAA Battalion, partially trained with only 2 sessions completed, achieved 9 confirmed kills, with an average of 2,800 rounds per kill. Still a significant improvement, though not as dramatic as the fully trained units. The 221st AAA Battalion, which had received no deflection training, fired approximately 48,000 rounds during Kasserine and achieved 3 confirmed kills. Their ratio of 16,000 rounds per kill was actually worse than the early campaign average, possibly because the intensity of combat led to more poorly aimed fire. The disparity was impossible to ignore. Fredendall's after-action report specifically noted that units trained in advanced deflection techniques demonstrated substantially improved effectiveness against enemy aircraft and recommended immediate, theater-wide implementation of the training program. By March 1943, Whitmore's methods had become standard practice for all anti-aircraft artillery units in North Africa. The training expanded beyond just 50-caliber machine guns to include 40mm Bofors crews and even 90mm gun battalions, though the principles applied most directly to the rapid-fire weapons engaging low-altitude targets. The psychological transformation was as important as the technical improvement. Gunners, who had felt helpless, who had watched aircraft attack their positions while their fire accomplished nothing, now saw their tracers connecting. They watched German fighters break off attacks when fire got too close. They saw Stukas trailing smoke after taking hits. The knowledge that their weapon could actually affect the battle changed their entire approach to air defense. Corporal Anthony Russo from the 867th AAA Battalion wrote home in April 1943, "We finally figured out how to hit the bastards. You don't aim at the plane. You aim at where the plane is going to be. Sounds stupid when you say it like that, but it works. Shot down a Stuka last week that was coming for our fuel dump. Felt like I'd won the damn war single-handed. Captain says we're getting good at this. About time." The Germans noticed the change too. Luftwaffe after-action reports from spring 1943 noted increased losses to American ground fire and specifically mentioned that American anti-aircraft artillery had become significantly more effective than encountered in previous months. Pilots were ordered to increase attack altitudes and reduce time over target during ground attack missions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation of American anti-aircraft gunnery in North Africa created a template, but it was the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 that would test whether the new methods could scale beyond individual battalions to an entire theatre of operations. Operation Husky, the Allied assault on Sicily, represented the largest amphibious invasion yet attempted in the war. Over 160,000 troops would storm ashore on the night of July 9th through 10th, supported by more than 3,000 ships and landing craft. The planners knew the Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica would contest the invasion heavily. Sicily sat barely 90 miles from North Africa, well within range of Axis airfields scattered across southern Italy and the island itself. Intelligence estimated the Germans and Italians had approximately 1,400 combat aircraft available in the Mediterranean theatre, and many of those would be thrown against the invasion fleet during the vulnerable early hours when troops were still coming ashore. Anti-aircraft defense would be critical. The invasion plan called for extensive coverage, with 50 caliber machine guns mounted on landing craft, half-tracks rolling off the beaches, and portable gun positions established within hours of the initial landings. But the gunners manning those weapons needed to be effective from the first moment because there wouldn't be time for learning curves once the shooting started. Between March and June 1943, the Army committed to training every anti-aircraft gunner in the Mediterranean theatre using Whitmore's deflection methods. This was an enormous undertaking. Thousands of soldiers needed hands-on training with live aircraft, and the aircraft needed to be available for training missions when they weren't, flying combat operations. The logistics were challenging, but the Kasserine Pass results had proven the investment worthwhile. Captain Whitmore, promoted to major in April, established 3 training centres in Tunisia. Each centre ran continuous 4-day cycles, rotating gun crews through intensive programs that combined classroom instruction, dry fire exercises, and live-fire training against Allied aircraft making simulated attack runs. By late June, approximately 6,800 anti-aircraft gunners had completed the full program. The training emphasized scenarios specific to amphibious operations. Gunners practiced engaging aircraft, making low-altitude runs over water, where the lack of terrain references made judging speed and distance more difficult. They drilled on targets approaching from multiple angles simultaneously, simulating the coordinated attacks Axis pilots favored. They learned to shift fire rapidly between targets without losing tracking discipline. One innovation that emerged during this period was the use of call and response techniques within gun crews. On a typical M2 mount, one soldier served as gunner, while 2 others fed ammunition and spotted targets. Whitmore's training taught the spotters to call out specific corrections. Lead more when rounds were trailing the target, or hold steady when the gunner achieved proper tracking. This verbal feedback allowed gunners to refine their aim without taking their eyes off the target to check tracer placement. Sergeant First Class Robert Hammond, who would land with the first wave at Gela on Sicily's southern coast, described the training intensity in a letter to his brother. "We've been shooting at our own planes for 3 weeks straight. P-40 seconds, A-20 seconds, even got some Spitfires from the RAF to buzz us. The Brits think we're crazy, burning through ammunition to practice not hitting planes. But I've seen what happens when you can't hit what you're shooting at. I was at Kasserine. This training works. When the Germans come at us in Sicily, we'll be ready. The invasion began at 20 minutes to midnight on July 9, 1943. Airborne forces dropped inland to secure key objectives, while the amphibious landings commenced along a 100-mile stretch of coastline. The initial hours went relatively smoothly, with lighter resistance than expected. But as dawn broke on July 10th, the Axis air forces arrived in strength. The first major air attack hit the American landing beaches at Gela around 0600 hours. A mixed formation of Ju-87 Stukas and Italian SM-79 bombers approached from the north, flying at roughly 8,000 feet before rolling into their attack dives. They targeted the dense concentration of ships and landing craft still crowding the beach, a target-rich environment where even near misses would cause casualties. But this time, the reception was different from what Axis pilots had encountered in previous battles. As the first Stukas began their dives, every 50 caliber gun within range opened fire. The difference from earlier campaigns was immediately apparent. The streams of tracer fire weren't spraying wildly or passing uselessly behind aircraft. They were leading correctly, creating visible curtains of steel that the diving aircraft had to fly through. The first Stuka took hits at 4,500 feet, still in its dive. 50 caliber rounds punched through the wing root and engine cowling. Black smoke began trailing immediately. The pilot tried to pull out but lost control. The aircraft ploughed into the beach 200 yards short of the waterline, the impact detonating its bomb load and creating a crater that would remain visible for days. The second Stuka made it through the dive and released its bomb, which exploded harmlessly in the surf between landing craft. As the pilot pulled up to escape, at least 3 different gun positions tracked him correctly. Multiple rounds struck the fuselage and cockpit. The Stuka continued flying for perhaps 5 seconds before rolling inverted and crashing into the Mediterranean half a mile offshore. Within the first hour of sustained air attacks at Gela, American gunners claimed 9 confirmed kills and 14 probables. The ammunition expenditure was still heavy, approximately 94,000 rounds of 50 caliber across all the beach defences, but the ratio had improved to roughly 10,000 rounds per confirmed kill. More importantly, the sheer volume and accuracy of fire forced many Axis pilots to break off their attacks early or release bombs from higher altitudes where accuracy suffered. Lieutenant Anthony Brusher, the same officer who had commanded the convoy with Sergeant Cupp's modified jeep mount in the Philippines, was now serving with the 45th Infantry Division at Skogliti, east of Gela. He watched the air battle unfold from a command post 300 yards inland. His after-action report, filed 3 days later, noted, "AA fire was the heaviest and most effective I've witnessed. German and Italian aircraft attempting to attack our positions were met with accurate fire from numerous 50 caliber positions. Multiple enemy aircraft observed shot down or damaged. Enemy pilots appeared to modify tactics mid-attack when encountering fire, suggesting suppressive effect even when hits not achieved." The suppressive effect Brusher mentioned was perhaps more valuable than the kill statistics alone suggested. An aircraft that broke off its attack run early, that dropped its bombs from an extra 1,000 feet of altitude, that chose a less optimal approach angle to avoid concentrated fire, was an aircraft that accomplished less damage even if it survived. The psychological impact on Axis pilots was real and measurable. A captured German pilot from St. Guy III, Stukageschwader III, who was shot down on July 11th, told interrogators that American anti-aircraft fire over Sicily was unexpectedly intense and accurate compared to previous encounters with American forces. He specifically mentioned that multiple aircraft in his unit had taken damage from 50 caliber fire and that pilots were requesting higher release altitudes, which would reduce bombing accuracy but improve survival rates. The Italian Regia Aeronautica, which had been flying Stukas since 1940, experienced similar losses. The 103rd Gruppo, flying Ju-87D variants from Sicilian airfields, lost 7 aircraft to ground fire in the first 4 days of the invasion. This represented more than 20% of their operational strength and forced the unit to suspend operations temporarily to absorb replacement aircraft and crews. Not every engagement went perfectly for the Americans. Friendly fire remained a persistent problem, with anti-aircraft gunners occasionally engaging Allied aircraft, particularly during the chaotic airborne operations on the night of July 11th, when C-47 transports carrying the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment flew over the invasion fleet. In the darkness and confusion, gunners on ships and shore batteries opened fire, mistaking the transports for enemy aircraft. 23 C-47 seconds were shot down and 37 damaged, with significant casualties among the paratroopers. The tragedy highlighted that while deflection training had solved the technical problem of hitting aircraft, it hadn't addressed the equally critical challenge of target identification under stress. The Army would spend the remainder of the war working on recognition training and establishing better communications between air and ground forces, but these solutions came too late for the men killed by friendly fire over Sicily. Despite this horrific incident, the overall effectiveness of American anti-aircraft artillery during the Sicily campaign represented a quantum leap from the early days in North Africa. By the time organized German resistance on Sicily ended on August 17, 1943, anti-aircraft units claimed a total of 143 confirmed aircraft kills and more than 200 probables. The ammunition expenditure ratios had stabilized at roughly 7,000 rounds per confirmed kill for 50 caliber guns, a number that would remain relatively consistent for the remainder of the war. The success in Sicily prompted the Army to standardize deflection training across all theaters. Training films were produced showing correct leading techniques using gun camera footage from successful engagements. Technical Manual 9-1521-310 was revised with a new appendix dedicated entirely to deflection shooting, complete with detailed diagrams and specific recommended lead distances for various aircraft types at different speeds and ranges. The new manual included a practical training sequence that could be implemented at any anti-aircraft artillery school or unit in the field. It specified minimum training requirements: at least 12 hours of dry-fire tracking exercises, 6 hours of live fire against towed targets moving at combat speeds, and where possible, live fire against friendly aircraft making simulated attack runs. This represented a dramatic expansion from the pre-war training standard of perhaps 4 hours total on moving targets. By September 1943, when American forces landed at Salerno on the Italian mainland, the transformation was complete. Anti-aircraft gunners arriving in Italy had been trained to deflection standards from the beginning of their instruction. They understood from day one that hitting aircraft required leading the target, and they'd practiced that skill hundreds of times before seeing combat. The Germans adapted too. Luftwaffe pilots operating over Italy received updated tactical guidance that specifically addressed American anti-aircraft effectiveness. They were instructed to avoid sustained straight-line approaches, to vary altitude and speed during attack runs, to use terrain masking where possible, and to increase standoff distances when delivering bombs or rockets. These adaptations reduced their vulnerability, but also reduced their effectiveness, forcing them to attack from positions that were less than optimal. Technical Sergeant Frank Delmonico, who had gone through the original Whitmore training in Tunisia and fought through Sicily and Italy, reflected on the transformation in a December 1943 interview with Stars and Stripes newspaper. "When I first got to North Africa, shooting at planes felt like throwing rocks at the moon. You'd fire and nothing would happen. The Germans would do whatever they wanted. Then we learned how to actually aim these guns properly, how to lead targets like you're shooting ducks, and suddenly we're knocking planes out of the sky. It's still hard, don't get me wrong. But now it's possible. Now we've got a chance." The deflection shooting methods developed in North Africa spread beyond anti-aircraft artillery. Navy gunners on ships adopted similar training for their 50 caliber and 20 mm Oerlikon guns. The principles influenced aerial gunnery training for bomber crews, leading to improved techniques for defensive fire against attacking fighters. Even tank crews received instruction in leading moving targets when using machine guns against enemy infantry or vehicles. The Pacific Theater implemented the training somewhat differently due to the different tactical environment. Japanese air tactics emphasized low-altitude attacks and kamikaze strikes during the later stages of the war, creating scenarios where engagement times were measured in seconds rather than the longer tracking opportunities common in Europe. Pacific gunners developed their own variations on the core principles, using abbreviated lead distances and accepting lower accuracy in exchange for higher volumes of fire during the brief engagement windows. Marine Corporal James Yoshida, manning a .50 caliber on Iwo Jima in February 1945, described the Pacific adaptation. "We don't have time to track nice and smooth like the training films show. A Zeke comes in fast and low. You've got maybe 3 seconds to hit him before he's past you or he's crashed into something. So we use a shorter lead, maybe half an aircraft length, and we just hose the area. It's not pretty, but it works often enough." The statistical improvements were consistent across theaters. From mid-1943 through the end of the war, American .50 caliber anti-aircraft guns averaged between 7,000 and 9,000 rounds per confirmed kill against aircraft. This represented roughly a 33% hit rate improvement over the early war period. While still far from perfect, it was effective enough to provide meaningful air defense and to force enemy pilots to respect American ground fire. The development of more sophisticated sighting systems paralleled the training improvements. By 1944, many anti-aircraft guns were being equipped with lead computing sights, particularly the Mark 9 sight for 40mm Bofors guns and various ring sights with built-in lead indicators for .50 caliber weapons. These devices mechanically calculated the required lead based on target speed and range inputs from the gunner, projecting the correct aim point onto a reflector sight. But even with mechanical aids, the fundamental skill of sustained tracking and smooth following remained essential. A computing sight could tell you where to aim, but you still had to maintain that aim point on a moving target while the aircraft maneuvered and your platform potentially moved beneath you. The human element couldn't be eliminated, only enhanced through training and technology working together. The lessons extended far beyond World War II. The deflection shooting principles developed by Whitmore and refined through combat experience became foundational doctrine for anti-aircraft gunnery. Modern systems like the Phalanx CIWS, which defends naval vessels against missiles using a radar-guided 20mm Gatling gun, operate on the same basic principle. Calculate where the target will be, not where it is, and direct fire to that future position. When the United States entered the Korean War in 1950, anti-aircraft gunners training at Fort Bliss learned deflection shooting as a core skill from their first day of instruction. The methods had been formalized, the training sequences refined, but the underlying technique remained unchanged from what desperate soldiers had figured out in the North African desert 7 years earlier. Vietnam saw another evolution when helicopter gunships created entirely new tactical situations. Door gunners on Hueys firing M60 machine guns at ground targets from moving aircraft had to master deflection in 3 dimensions, accounting for their own movement, the target's movement, and the relative velocities between them. But the principles were the same. Lead the target. Track smoothly. Watch where your rounds go and adjust. The human challenge remained constant across all these evolutions. Training someone to aim at empty space, to fire at a point where nothing currently exists, required overcoming powerful instincts. Every fiber of human perception insists you should aim at the visible threat. Overriding that instinct, developing the muscle memory to lead correctly, demanded repetition and immediate feedback. No amount of classroom instruction could substitute for actually doing it. Private First Class Raymond Kellner, the gunner who missed the Stukas on November 14, 1942, eventually completed Whitmore's training program in February 1943. He went on to serve through the Sicily and Italy campaigns. His personal record showed 3 confirmed aircraft kills and 5 probables by the time he rotated home in November 1944. He survived the war and returned to Nebraska, where he worked as a machinist for 43 years. In a 1988 interview for a local veterans history project, Kellner was asked what he remembered most about his service. His answer was immediate: learning how to finally hit what I was shooting at. I spent 3 months in North Africa feeling useless, watching planes attack us while my bullets went nowhere. Then someone finally taught us the right way to do it, and everything changed. I went from being a spectator with a loud noisemaker to actually being able to defend my guys. That mattered. That was worth everything. Major Theodore Whitmore received the Legion of Merit for his work developing and implementing the deflection training program. The citation specifically noted that his methods materially increased the effectiveness of Allied anti-aircraft defenses and contributed significantly to air superiority in the Mediterranean theater. He remained in the Army after the war, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 1958. He returned to teaching, spending 15 years as a high school physics instructor in Madison, Wisconsin, where he died in 1976. The transformation of American anti-aircraft gunnery represents a specific case study in a broader pattern that repeated throughout World War II. The United States entered the war with industrial capacity, motivated soldiers, and excellent equipment, but without combat experience. The learning curve was steep and paid for in blood. Kasserine Pass, the early losses in the Pacific, the bomber casualties over Germany, all represented tuition in the School of War. But the American military's institutional willingness to identify problems, develop solutions, and rapidly implement them across entire theaters gave it a crucial advantage. The army that landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, was fundamentally different from the army that stumbled at Kasserine Pass 17 months earlier, not because the soldiers were braver or the equipment was better, but because the institution had learned from its mistakes and systematically corrected them. The deflection shooting story illustrates this pattern perfectly. The problem was identified through combat experience. Solutions were developed by analyzing what successful gunners were doing differently. Training programs were created and tested. Results were measured and validated. The successful methods were standardized and taught theater-wide. The entire cycle from problem identification to widespread implementation took less than 6 months. Modern military doctrine calls this process lessons learned, but that sterile term doesn't capture the human reality. The lessons were learned by men like Raymond Kellner, who fired at aircraft and missed, who felt helpless while their positions were attacked, who carried the guilt of not being able to protect their fellow soldiers. The solutions came from people like Theodore Whitmore, who understood that teaching was about more than conveying information. It was about building skills through practice and feedback. And the validation came in the skies over Sicily, over Italy, over France, where American gunners who had learned to aim at empty air watched their tracers find their marks. Where German pilots broke off attacks because the fire was too accurate. Where aircraft that should have reached their targets instead fell burning from the sky. The mathematics tell part of the story. 6,000 rounds per kill becoming 7,000 rounds per kill represents a roughly 15% efficiency improvement. But the mathematics don't capture what it meant to the soldiers on the ground when their anti-aircraft guns actually worked, when they could fight back effectively instead of just making noise while enemy aircraft attacked with impunity. Staff Sergeant Marcus Delahunt, who wrote in November 1942 that "We're shooting at ghosts," survived the war and kept a journal through the Italy campaign. His final entry, dated April 29, 1945, 3 days before German forces in Italy surrendered, included this passage. 5 years ago, I was teaching 7th grade mathematics in Baltimore. Now I've spent 3 years shooting at aircraft. Turns out teaching and shooting have something in common. You can't do either one effectively unless you understand where your target is going, not just where it is right now. Funny how long it took us to figure that out. Funny how much it mattered once we did. The last major air attack against American positions in Europe occurred on April 30, 1945, when a handful of German aircraft made a final desperate strike against bridge crossings over the Po River in northern Italy. Anti-aircraft gunners from the 512th AAA Battalion engaged the formation. They destroyed 2 aircraft confirmed, damaged 3 others, and forced the remaining planes to abort their attack runs without releasing ordnance. The battalion expended approximately 14,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition in the engagement. The war in Europe ended 8 days later. The war in the Pacific continued until August 15, 1945, but by that point, American air superiority was so complete that Japanese aircraft rarely appeared over American positions. The anti-aircraft gunners who had learned to hit moving targets in the North African desert found themselves with few opportunities to employ their hard-won skills. But those skills hadn't been developed for nothing. Every aircraft shot down was one that didn't drop its bombs. Every pilot forced to break off early was an attack that failed. Every gunner who could defend his position effectively was one less vulnerability in an already dangerous war. The aggregate effect of thousands of trained gunners achieving even modest improvements in hit rates translated to lives saved, missions completed, and objectives achieved. In the end, the story of American anti-aircraft gunnery in World War II isn't about technology or tactics in the abstract. It's about young men learning to do something that violated their instincts, that required trusting physics over perception, that demanded they aim at nothing in order to hit something. It's about the institutional flexibility that allowed solutions to emerge from combat experience rather than from pre-war doctrine. And it's about the reality that wars are won not just by courage or industrial capacity, but by the ability to learn faster than your enemy. The gunners who learned to lead their targets, who mastered deflection shooting under fire, who turned ineffective weapons into genuine threats against enemy aircraft, proved that human beings can adapt to challenges that evolution never prepared them for. When survival demands it, when training supports it, when feedback allows it, people can learn to aim at empty sky and hit what needs hitting. Private Kellner, firing at that first Stuka in November 1942, represents the beginning of that journey. The same soldier, 9 months later, tracking a Messerschmitt correctly and watching his rounds connect, represents its completion. Between those 2 moments lies the essence of what military training at its best can achieve: the transformation of instinct through practice, knowledge into skill, potential into performance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.